So, welcome everybody. My name is Sue Bray. I'm a Service Manager for Safeguarding Adults at West Berkshire Council, and I'm here with.
I'm Rebecca Berry. I'm Head of Safeguarding and Quality Assurance at Wokingham Borough Council.
And we're here to basically have a conversation about the Sandra SAR and have a discussion about the key themes and issues arising from the SAR that we felt we could unpick a little bit and give an additional flavour to the actual full report, which of course is available to you, to anyone to have a look at. So just for a bit of background, Sandra was a 65-year-old lady with a number of long-term health issues, which included obesity, orthopedic and mobility issues. So Sandra's engagement with services was a bit erratic, and as a result, she was often discharged from services without really receiving the support that had been intended for her. Sandra had a son who suffered from poor mental health, and he had his own quite significant support needs. During her life, the latter part, there were issues and concerns around the son physically assaulting Sandra, hoarding her home, and exposing her to emotional and financial abuse. So even though Sandra had a single occupancy tenancy, there was evidence that the son was frequently present at her home, even though he wasn't supposed to be there. So in June 22, Sandra sustained an injury in her home. It was quite a minor injury, but it became infected and she ended up being hospitalised as a result of that. And in hospital, her condition deteriorated quite quickly and she died very soon after that. So the Safeguarding Adult Review was commissioned to try and understand how different agencies have worked together over the time to safeguard Sandra, but also to identify lessons to improve systems, practice and partnership working. And I think it was felt that there was probably quite a lot of learning to come from this. And certainly in the course of sort of like working on the content for this podcast, I think we both Becca and I felt that there was, certainly something here that was worth having a conversation about and unpicking some of the themes that the SAR had identified.
Yeah, we did, didn't we, Sue? And we thought, there's a really good 7-minute learning on the board's website, and there's some other stuff on there. But actually, alongside that, there were some particular themes that we felt that actually would be useful for us to sort of unpick, because as we'd gone through them with our teams and read them ourselves, we just thought, actually, there's some other bits here that we wanted to talk through, wasn't there?
Definitely. And I think sometimes those SARs they're important, they bring out learning, but they're also just a starting point as well. And I think, if you want to unpick them a little bit more, they're quite rich in terms of what they can provide.
Yeah.
So that's what we felt. And we certainly, in terms of the content that we felt we wanted to draw out on, it's on the slide in front of us. So definitely we've got some things to say, haven't we, about
yes very unusual for us, Sue. Yes. So
I've always got something to say.
Yeah. So first of all, what really struck me when reading through Sandra's life was it was really interesting, because you mentioned before about her being in a single occupancy place, but because actually she'd been evicted previously because her son had come to live with her. So it looked like there was not really any issues around hoarding behaviour before. And then her son came to live with her. And then there were concerns about hoarding behaviour. And then she was evicted into a single occupancy place. And then later down the line, it appears that the work that was being done, people were concentrating on hoarding behaviour and not looking back and thinking, oh, hang on, this isn't her hoarding behaviour.
Right.
So what really came out for me was actually, how do we, Sue and I have been around a while and remember when you had paper files and you would get allocated a case and you'd spend a period of time, you would be going through it, you'd be looking back, wouldn't you? And I think we've gained so much with stuff being online, of course. I'm not a dinosaur, but with that, you don't do that, do you? And so you lose a bit of that history taking, don't you?
Definitely. And I think history is so important, you know, to be able to, it's not just about what's happening today, it's what's led up to today, you know, and
Mm.
what has shaped today. And then the lens that you look at things through sometimes really needs to take a view of the historical sort of
Mm.
like trail of that individual, just to get a clear picture, because I think it's very easy to miss things if you've not got a good sort of like grasp of the person, and what has led up to where they are today.
Yeah, because, actually, what was happening was that they were concentrating on what was the presenting thing at that point. Somebody's got a home that is got lots of hoarded stuff in it, but actually nobody was thinking this is in the context of a potentially abusive relationship, um, and tackling that. And I know we're going to talk about it in a minute, but that comes down to getting the person at the centre of it as well as the chronologies. But yeah, that was really one of our first thoughts, wasn't it? About getting that history and that chronology. Yeah, so just another thing about chronologies is being able to spot patterns, and notice when there's escalating risk. Because if you don't know what's happened before, how can you predict what might happen in the future?
Absolutely, or even connect what is happening now to where that might have come from, and
Mm.
what was triggering certain behaviours or certain sort of like events. I think chronology is key, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Sandra's case, as I said, if a chronology was looked at, you'd be able to see actually prior to the sun moving in, there was no concern about hoarding behaviour. So the focus of the work could have been about the the potential for domestic abuse from adult child to parent, and looking at tackling that rather than looking at let's sort out the self-neglect and hoarding, because she can't sort it out because actually it's not her hoarding behaviour. Yeah.
And being able to separate out then the two, because actually we know that the son has needs, you know, that was
Yes.
clear. So being able to focus on both rather
Yeah.
than just one person, because you're never going to solve a problem if you're looking at the wrong person.
No, absolutely. And what I thought when I was reading it as well is, if a really robust conversation had happened with her about what was important to her, clearly she was putting her son's needs to have somewhere to live over her own need to live in a safe environment. And actually, if we'd asked her, what do you want to happen? She might have said exactly what you said, Sue. I want my son to get help.
Yeah,
His mental health, housing, whatever that might be. Sometimes those are the levers, aren't they,
yeah,
to work with someone. So
absolutely.
absolutely, which kind of brings us on to one of your hot topics is, visiting in person.
Absolutely. Oh, I just, you know, so in Sandra's case, there was a number of safeguarding concerns raised by various different partners at quite an early stage in the period of time that was looked at for the SAR. And those concerns reference the environmental condition of the home, which we've just said that actually probably wasn't her, to be fair.
Hmm.
So self-neglect, clutter, behaviours of the son, including acting violently and criminally damaging the flat. And these concerns were dealt with either by telephone call, where on
Wow.
each occasion Sandra said, "Oh, I'm fine," or by
Mm.
letter, which Sandra never responded to. And whilst we completely recognise that there are structural and capacity issues that impact on the team that initially dealt with those concerns, it appears there was no consideration given to any sort of unannounced, or announced personal visit to see what was actually going on in the home.
Yeah.
You know,
And
you can have a report and it can tell you something, but unless you actually see for yourself or try to see for yourself, then sometimes a visit is not appropriate.
mm,
It depends what's being, you know, if domestic abuse has been suggested, it might be that you would think about a different way.
Yeah.
But either or, you would want to see that person. You would want to see them in person, and the telephone call, I don't think always cuts it, because it's very easy to not, if you're the person on the end of the phone, to just say what someone wants
Yeah.
to hear.
Yeah. No, I'm absolutely fine. Don't, you
Yeah,
know, yeah.
you
And I
can't
think
see language, and you can't see for yourself what's happening.
exact, and it is a bit of a hangover from COVID, because obviously we rapidly, you know, so as social services, we rapidly changed how we worked in order to keep people safe, so that we weren't in and out of their houses potentially spreading COVID. And I get that, but we need to make sure that the practice hasn't got so far away from the benefits of going out to see people. And as you mentioned, the things that were being flagged up was about the condition of the property. Well, you can't see that until you're not going to be able to make an assessment of the level of that unless you see it with your own eyes. And as you say about domestic abuse, um, if you're speaking to somebody on the phone and they're saying I'm fine, you don't know whether the person who is potentially abusing them is stood there saying, don't say anything, don't say anything. So that's why we make safe inquiries through domestic abuse, where we make sure that we're speaking to the person on their own. And often that's face to face.
Yeah, I mean, we do recognise that in some circumstances, an in-person interaction might be unhelpful at that
Yeah.
particular time, or intrusive. However, you can't get away from the fact that a face-to-face visit allows the worker to observe a person in their own environment. You know, pick up the signs, pick up the non-verbal communication clues that are there. See the environment that someone's living in firsthand. You know, and think about Sky actually do quite an interesting decision-making tool to help workers establish what's the most effective and appropriate way of working with somebody.
Oh, do
It's quite
they?
and it's a bit of a guide to think of it, but I think there's lots of resources in different places that are always worth having a look at. Some of those kind of professional websites that kind of guide you to being able to work out if you're a bit stuck, and you know there's plenty of help out there, I think, that's supportive. But I come back to the fact that, you know, I really think a face-to-face, because interestingly, Sandra expressed a view to the police in August 2018, which was, you know, some time before she died, in fairness, we go back to this history, that her son living in a home was ruining her life.
Right.
And that was followed by a referral from police to safeguard him. But it was, she gave a contrary view to the social
Yeah.
worker who rang her, and she said,
Well,
I'm fine. And that in itself for me should have gone, oh, bit of a red flag, you know,
yeah.
to have a think about this. What's the best way to tackle it? Because it's unlikely that her son is ruining her life on Monday, but everything's fine on Tuesday.
Yeah. And
Uh,
that contradictory information absolutely comes through in whether to have a visit, because even when we're not talking about a concern about abuse from somebody else, if we're talking about self-neglect, often you speak to somebody on the phone, they say absolutely fine, then you go to the property and it's entirely different matter. I mean, you know, I countless visits I've been on, and the reality. And that kind of ties in a bit as well around executive functioning, because if somebody is saying, no, I completely understand that I need to not eat moldy food because it will make me sick, and you go and see them and their fridge is full of nothing but moldy food, that's telling you there's a difference between what they're saying and what they're doing. And you can only see that with your eyes.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's,
Oh, well, I think we're in agreement with that,
I
Sue.
think we are, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the other bits that we were talking about was confirmation bias, and I think we've covered it a little bit already, in that sometimes if you think you know what's going on, you only look for information that confirms that already held view. So I think confirmation bias was at play here for Sandra, as we've said, that people, without having that historical viewpoint, were looking and going, oh, this is a referral about self-neglect and hoarding behaviour. Therefore, I'm going out or not going out, looking at the work and thinking I'm looking at it as a self-neglect concern, not thinking what else is going on here.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and we're all guilty of that sometimes. You know, you look at a set of circumstances and you think, oh, I can see what's happening here.
Yeah.
And actually, then you simply look for things that confirm what you think, and perhaps put to one side the things that slightly jar with your view.
Yeah.
And that's the danger, isn't it? Is ignoring some of the, or not ignoring. Ignoring is the wrong word to use, but sort of perhaps giving less weight to some of the things that don't quite fit what you think is happening, what
Yeah.
you've got in your mind.
And interesting, it says on the slide here, knowing confirmation bias exists doesn't stop you experiencing it. It's not an active choice to think, you know, I'm definitely not going to consider other options. It's our human brain. It's how it works, that if we already believe something to be the case, then we'll find information that backs that up rather than looking for something completely against. And that's why when we're doing safeguarding work, thinking about different hypotheses of what could be going on, what are different explanations of what could be going on, and then trying to disprove each of them rather than thinking, okay, I kind of know what's going on here, I'm going to start doing the work. It's that prep work, that thought prep work, isn't it?
I certainly think it's something about being systemic as well, about taking the evidence that you have been able to, that is supported evidence, you know, and be able to go, okay, and look at them each in their, you know, you look at them in their totality, but you look at each piece, because what you don't want to do is miss a bit by your brain telling you that actually I don't need to think about that because that doesn't really quite fit with this, all this weight of evidence over here. Here is the one thing that doesn't really go with it.
Yeah.
I think trying to think in that quite systemic way about each piece of evidence, I think is will help.
Exactly.
To try and get caught in that natural sort of like jumping in.
Well, you're totally right, Sue, because we have to have systems in place to help us, to help our human brains manage and keep that information logical. I mean, there's loads of safeguarding adult reviews where it talks about confirmation bias. Matthew Bates, which was a Sussex SAR, talks about that. You know, that there was, from the very beginning of the inquiry, there was a belief that manual handling was the issue, and therefore nothing else was considered about unexplained injuries. And we know that unexplained injuries, it could be an accident, could be a deliberate act. But you've got to think about all of them, haven't you?
You absolutely have. Yeah, it's and interesting. I think I do recognise that people are time poor. You know, within the services, they've got to so actually. And that there is a desire to get something right, to make something right so that it's working for people. And I think when you're time poor, and you add a little bit of confirmation bias, not jumping to conclusions, but you conclude that this is what's happening, you try to put in solutions from a very good place because you want to make it right for somebody, but we might be missing things. And I think sort of like poverty of time has a lot to answer for that.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, though, without putting that in, that little bit of, I mean, it takes a couple of beats, doesn't it, to think about what is the worst, you know, what is the possible explanations, you know, letting your mind go to the worst possible explanation, but also the most sort of okay explanation. Putting that bit of work in to do that takes less time than unpicking something that's gone very wrong at the end. But also, if our safeguarding work hasn't followed that systemic route, then what we put in place isn't going to take away somebody's experience of that abuse or neglect, which means it's going to come back through again. So even if we're thinking not of, you know, absolutely the person is at the centre of it, but even if we're thinking about it from staff point of view, people that are working, you want to stop that abuse or neglect, but you also, thinking about time, you don't want it to come back through again because you're going to be unpicking things.
Yeah, no,
Mm,
absolutely, absolutely. It's such an interesting topic. It's so,
mm.
you know, it has such an impact on the way that we think. So yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
maybe we'll do another podcast on just that entirely, Sue. Um, so adult family abuse, we were talking a bit about that, weren't we? That
Yeah, because this really was a feature. I think this was a feature. You know,
mm,
this was not about a lady necessarily who was self-neglecting and hoarding. This was about a lady who was in a relationship with her child. You know,
mm,
who was an adult, and uh, had it had the biggest impact on her, and that's kind of where we ended up with so many concerns raised by different professionals who'd come into contact with her. And when we were prepping for this podcast, I did a little bit of, you know, like super Googling, like you do, Google Scholar,
mm.
um, my friend. Um, we, I, there was a case in 2021, we sort of like BU, and in this case, this went to court. It was all around the capacity of a lady to maintain contact with a particular person who'd come into her life. And whilst it wasn't a child, it was somebody who was much younger than her, but also had kind of made a real connection. Perhaps
Right.
not in a very helpful way. The family didn't think it's been in a very helpful way, but she
Okay. So they were
certainly
in a relationship.
there was a relationship of sorts, but there was a really big age gap between
Right.
them as well. So, you know, and in that particular case, they had some expert kind of evidence, and the judge concluded that because of the coercive nature of the control which was found to exist in the relationship, BU was deprived of her autonomous decision making. So, in short, she wasn't able to exercise her free will in the context of any ongoing relationship with this particular defendant.
Right.
And the professor who gave that expert evidence, so that's Professor Dubrow Marshall, referenced a trauma bond
Mm.
between the two, and he defined that as sort of like trauma coerced attachment, total reliance and dedication to the other, and completely then psychologically bound up with that particular individual, to the point that she believed she was making decisions about that contact willingly, but that in reality it was part of that trauma attachment, and she couldn't make authentic decisions independently of that particular individual. So when I thought about that, and then I thought about Sandra and their kind of connection, clearly, you know, the parent child in most cases is a very sort of like definitive bond.
Mm.
And in terms of the relation, whilst the nature of the relationship was a bit different, you really could make the connections, or I certainly could anyway, but across the two sort of like pieces. I don't know how you feel about that,
Yeah,
but
completely. Because I think sometimes we can get a bit mixed up with capacity, can't we? With domestic abuse, adult family abuse, where it's other members of the family, we can get caught up with, well, he or she has capacity to make that decision. But actually, when exactly that case really illustrates that actually capacity is a bit of a red herring there, because for someone that has no cognitive impairment, no concerns about their capacity, if they are in a relationship where coercion and control is present, those decisions aren't freely made. And you are not making decisions in your own best interest, and that can be for all of us, anyone that would be in a domestic abuse relationship. And the added layer, as you said, is the parent child
yeah,
bond, because that's almost impossible. It's very hard to break against that.
yeah.
uh,
And you could, I think, for in Sandra's case, there was definitely enough there, and she has sufficiently strong attachments to her son that it would have been reasonable to start to question whether her autonomous decision making about that contact and allowing him into her home, even though she knew she told the police in 2018 he ruins my life,
yes.
but yet he was still coming in.
Yeah.
And that tells you really something about potentially what was going on in terms of her decision making. How do you turn your child down? How do you turn them away when you've got that connection?
And especially a child with their own needs.
Yeah.
Because as far as she was concerned, potentially she's thinking, who else is going to look out for him? He's not well. Who else is there? So he's making her life hell, as she said to the police. But what else is she going to do?
There's a desire to protect, isn't there? It's kind of an innate desire.
There is.
And to keep that relationship going at all costs, I think.
Yeah.
Because of what it means to you.
Which kind of brings, so in preparation, I was looking, in 2020, there was a thematic review of homicides in London. Now, obviously, we're not talking about that with Sandra's situation, but they looked at adult family abuse, and they looked at where people had been killed by members of their family. And in all but 2 of the cases they looked at, the relationship between victim and perpetrator was that of parent-child. So that speaks to what we've been speaking about. And also, nearly all the perpetrators in the case of family violence had serious mental health problems. And there was a caring relationship between the victim and perpetrator. So we've got lots of that research there's lots that's similar with Sandra.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Really interesting. I've done a little bit of research previously about the impact of domestic abuse on older people. You know, so and the relevance of home and family community and all of that, your status there, and the kind of shame that sits potentially with the identifying that you are being abused, even if you recognise it.
Yeah.
And looking at appropriate interventions that are age appropriate, to try and you don't resolve is the wrong word, but to try and lessen the impact of that. And I think, you know, lots of people, not just older people, but there's a bit of a trend for older people to minimise the what's happening in their home.
It's interesting you just said shame, because actually that ties into the parent-child thing as well, because there's a certain amount of shame attached to casting a child in need out, isn't there? You know, even if it is a 40-year-old child, there's that element of shame that you're not able to look after that child.
Both in terms of not being able to look after that child, but also potentially, what have I brought this child up?
Yes.
You know, or am I feeling guilty because I didn't bring that child up? You know, there's lots of different
so many dimensions. And just as well, the domestic homicide oversight mechanism for adult social care, that was looked at as well. That was only recently came out. And again, it's got similar findings around people acting as the main carer, and about you know, what they focused on as well is that the need to train on different types of abuse, that adult family abuse is absolutely a factor, which I don't think, when we think domestic abuse, we might close our eyes and think woman, working age with kids. That's our first sort of thought. We're not thinking about older people. We're not thinking about it being other family members. We're not thinking about same-sex relationships. We're not thinking about that the survivor or the victim have care and support needs themselves. So we're not thinking about people with learning disabilities, people with physical disabilities. You know, we've got a picture. I'm glad that we've got much more of an idea about thinking about domestic abuse. However, we're still just thinking of that as quite one-dimensional pictures sometimes.
And that's where the historical kind of understanding the history of somebody is quite important, because, you know, certainly when they're older, and you know, when you think about the carer relationship, you know, that changes the dynamic of a relationship anyway, doesn't it? One person has developed care and support needs, but I suppose one of the things that's easy to jump to conclusion is that this is carer breakdown.
Yes.
You know, but actually thinking, well, maybe it was always like this. You know, but it's just come to our attention because this person no longer has you know, the cognitive sort of like ability to either hide it or
and
not, that it comes back to sort of like your bias, doesn't it? You know,
It
I
does.
jumped straight into, I think this is a carer relation, you know, this
Yeah,
carer breakdown issue, and it's not. And I know we're drifting off of Sandra a little bit, because, but all of these things are so tied in, aren't they? And
they
they're all
are.
to
They
kind of
are.
talk about.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that, as you said, that comes back to that confirmation bias. How we manage that out is through systems. If we think there's domestic abuse present, but that person's already always also there's a carer cared for relationship, the hypotheses should be this is carer breakdown or it's domestic abuse, and we don't just go down one of those
yeah, yeah,
funnels. So we did also comment, didn't we, about, so there's lots of stuff on the board website for people to look at about Section 11 of the Care Act, which is basically telling us that anyone in their life, if adult social care say, would you like an assessment? They can say, no, thank you very much. But there are two circumstances where they can't say no, thank you very much. The first being if they lack capacity and it would be in their best interest to do so. The second one is if they're experiencing abuse or neglect. And I think there's been a shift in practice and about understanding of that. And I think we've moved that people are now doing those assessments. For me, where we're at now is a bit like, okay, so what now?
yeah,
What do we do? So when we've done the assessment, even though the person said they didn't want one, and then that ties in, and this is a bit of sort of get a bit dry and lawry, but Section 13 of the Care Act talks about after we've decided that someone has care and support needs, it says that the local authority, the social services, must tell the person a written record of that and the reasons for it and how they might meet their needs. So, you know, a factor being what next? And there are times, you know, if we might not have to meet the need of the person. It might be if the person doesn't want us to, but again, that goes back to capacity coercion. If somebody's saying no, is it because they lack capacity to say no, or is it because they're not making a freely made decision? So just very briefly, because it is a, you know, I don't want to make it a law podcast, but it's the what next and what happens in Section 13. And there's just an arrow there on the slide which takes us through the what next bit.
I mean, I always think these sort of like models and sort of visuals are really helpful. I think sometimes it's very hard to then put that into practice, isn't it? When you've actually got somewhere, and like I said, I know we're drifting off a little bit, but if you've got somebody there who's absolutely adamant that they don't want you, not having you, don't want you, and it's not the capacity issue that would prompt a Section 11 assessment, but it is the risk of,
Yeah.
of neglect and abuse.
Oh, well, that takes us very
Whatnot.
nicely, Sue.
It does, doesn't
It
it?
does.
Wow, what a
Gosh,
segue.
how professional.
I hadn't even thought of that. So one of the things that we do have within the partnership is the multi-agency risk management framework, or MARM as it's called. It's been called other things in the past, but currently it's under the title of MARM. And one of the key findings from Sandra SAR was that there was a need to promote the current multi-agency arrangements to share information and develop sort of like joint safeguarding plans. And this should improve understanding of when a referral would still be appropriate in the absence of consent. So MARM tends to get used when all other options have been exhausted. So you've gone down the safeguarding route, you've not been able to, and the risk still remains, and there is considerable consent, or you've gone down the care management route and there is still considerable risk, and you know a Section 42 is not necessarily going to make a difference to the outcome. Where do you go with that? Which is always a challenge. So
yeah, and it's where you can't, you've gone down, you've explored capacity, and that person has capacity, so you don't have those routes, do you? So you've left with loads of risk. You've got someone with capacity and you're left with loads of risk.
So this, I think what this gives you is an opportunity to gather as many people that are relevant that you can get around the table to unpick that risk I mean, you probably unpicked it quite a lot anyway. But there are other parties who may be able to support with that. And the mum, you know, should include the person who is at risk, because as with all of our sort of like safeguarding, this kind of fits within that whole process. Person-centered, you know, care management is person-centered. This should be all about the person in the middle of it. And this is almost a final opportunity, really, isn't it, to say these are the things that we're really concerned about. Here's the risk. Now, by definition of getting to a mom, I think, you know, the person doesn't always want to participate in that because they want you to go away and leave them alone anyway, or they just aren't able or haven't been able to participate in or take advantage of some of the kind of support that has been made available for what that might be. So the mom is there, I think.
And it pulls together some of the things that we've talked about chronologies and shared risk. And, you know, we hear in every single safeguarding adult review that's ever been written, we hear lots of agencies held lots of bits of information, but nobody pulled it together. And so if something isn't going through a safeguarding framework and it isn't going through a mental capacity framework, but there's lots of unmanaged risk, which is often around self-neglect, then the mom is there to be a pathway to share that risk, to share that knowledge, to look at history. And sometimes it means the decision is actually we need to seek legal advice. We need to think about the inherent jurisdiction of the court because the risk is so high here.
Absolutely. I mean, the Section 42 process gives an opportunity for those multi-agency meetings to occur anyway, you know, and I think my feeling sometimes is that we don't use those well enough, or we don't as frequently enough to be able to draw in all of those people that may have bits of the jigsaw or may have something really positive to contribute that might lessen the risk. So the mom is there as a sort of like, you know, it's supportive of the case management process as well. It comes from either end, because you're right. I think it's kind of I say the end game. I'm sure that's probably not the right terminology to use, but I think it is when all routes have been exhausted and there is still significant risk. What do you do with it? Well, you share the risk. You know, if you haven't been able to share that risk already, it's an opportunity to get people around. And, you know, you might have explored inherent jurisdiction already, or you might not have done, but it's a chance for everybody to put on the table the bits that they know that you might have missed.
And also the opportunity for advice from senior management, because mom escalates things into the senior management sphere within the local authority, but also within the other agencies that are working with that person. So it's about getting that advice from experienced practitioners, really.
And I would say that on the website, the SAB website, there's a couple of really useful sort of flow charts and things to help you make some decisions about. And actually, they were born out of the Sandra SAR to start with. You know, what do I do with this? You know, and I think sometimes I quite like a little flow chart.
Who doesn't?
Said to you earlier, I like to write everything down, which I do. I also quite like a little bit of visual because and I just think it's quite useful to help people navigate what is available to me. What are the routes where I can take something? You know, I'm concerned about this. I've got my Section 42. It's not really gone anywhere. I'm stuck. And you know what? Sometimes you stay stuck. You know, but at least if you've explored all of the avenues, you know, to some extent, the risk, whilst it might still exist, is perhaps being managed in a more coordinated way, or you have accepted that risk is there, and that risk, you know,
and you've accepted. So the two parts really, because we're all about choice, aren't we, for people, and until you go all the way down a pathway, let's say, of mental capacity assessments, and until you've gone down a pathway of exploring whether it's a freely made decision and that person is making it without any coercion, then you've got the person at the center of it, but you've got to make sure that they're making a decision that is capacitated and they're making a decision that's free of coercion. So all of those, there's always another route to explore that, and that's what all of this guidance is on the board website. And this is the, as you say, Sue, this flowchart came out of Sandra SAR to help people understand at what point do I raise a safeguarding concern. So this is a useful flowchart to have on there. It also helps people understand about it being okay to raise a safeguarding concern without that person's consent, because the work that is then done under safeguarding puts that person at the centre of it. Is that making safeguarding personal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Element. Yeah. So there we are. I think it's been really good to talk to you about Sandra, and really good to sort of actually have this chance for us to reflect upon it and discuss it, and then hopefully some of what we've said will be useful to others. And
I hope so. I think, you know, like I said, sometimes you can read a SAR, and it is on the SAB website, as is the 7-minute learning that goes with it. But it can be a bit dry. It can be very dry, to the point that you think, oh, you know, maybe I can't quite get to the end of that. And when people are busy, you know, and when people have got sort of like things on, reading a 21-page SAR is not going to be top of your agenda. You might read the short briefing, but you're not necessarily going to get into it. So having the opportunity, I think, to have a conversation about it, and hopefully people to listen to that, it's not quite as, you know, you can have it on in the background as you're doing other things, might actually pique some. And it also gives you an opportunity to unpick in a bit more detail, I think, some of the things that because I think some of the things that we've identified and talked about are relative to Sandra, but are beyond Sandra as well, if that makes sense. And hopefully giving people an opportunity to just have a think about other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for chatting with me today, Sue. And that's us signing off. Thank you.
I think they call it's a wrap, don't they?
Oh, do they? Okay. Well, you're more professional than me.
Not really.
Okay.